ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. I greet you with peace, and it is indeed peace that we need in these times. We need a peace of peace in our lives. We need peace also in our minds as well. I think a lot of people are obviously feeling the lockdown, and this is going to carry on for, you know, months, at least another month, maybe 2, maybe 3. Allahu alam. We'll have to see. We'll have to see how things pan out, how well the nation abides by the instructions of our rulers, who are doing it in our interests. And subhanallah, you know, we've seen already, we're hearing about it all the time, the toll that this is taking upon our loved ones, upon people in the Muslim community as well, quite notably. You know, the youngest person to pass away yesterday, 13 years old, was a Muslim. The first doctor to pass away, retired doctor, was a Muslim. The first practicing, active doctor, actively practicing, also Muslim, 63 years old, rahimahullah. And it reminds me really of the beautiful dua, the dua that we pray in janazah, and I feel like it would be quite apt to pray it now for all the ones that are passing away. We know that actually some of the first people to pass away were Muslims, subhanallah, strangely enough, and a large proportion of the first few people were Muslims as well. And the dua that the Prophet ﷺ taught us, and we read it in the janazah prayer, is Allahumma ighfir li hayyina wa mayyitina. Allah, have mercy, have compassion on the living and those who have passed away. وَشَاهِدْنَا وَغَائِبِنَا, and those who are present and those who aren't present, who are absent. وَصَغِيرِنَا وَكَبِيرِنَا, and the young and the old. And we know that this is taking people of all ages. It's a misunderstanding to think that it's only, you know, the really old people that are passing away with this. وَذَكْرِنَا وَأُنْثَانَا, and the males and the females amongst us. Allahumma man ahyaytahu minna fa'ahyihi ala al-Islam. And this is a beautiful point, is that Allah, whoever is still living amongst us, let him live in Islam. And we know that this is the difference between Islam and Iman, is that Islam is about the active living. So we're praying that Allah help us to hold on to the goodness and the light that has been given to us by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the guidance that he brought us. Let us hold on to that in these times. وَمَنْ تَوَفَّيْتَهُ مِنَّا فَتَوَفَّهُ عَلَى الْإِيمَانِ. And that those that have been taken away, that have passed away, then let them pass away on Iman, because that's what will count. That's what will light up the path to bliss, to sakina, to tranquility in the gardens of eternity, inshallah. Okay, I will continue now with our subject, and it seems that, you know, in such grave times that we are talking about something which is somewhat technical and detached from like the gravity of our reality at the moment, but in some ways, you know, it is still a connection, and what we're trying to do here is to authentically connect with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Who was this man? That's what we're actually asking, and we're going through our long heritage of trying to grapple with the meaning of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life. And that's really what this is about. So, you know, you have hadith which are instances. They're just literally snapshots of the Prophet's life. That's all they are. And they don't always on their own give us the full picture. So we know that, you know, the full picture is the Sunnah, and that's the way, that's the kind of light, it's the example of the Prophet, and that's what we are obliged to follow, and we know that. So we've been on a journey. Let me start sharing the screen. One moment. Here we are. Okay. So, and I'll just make sure I can see the chat as well. Okay. It's always nice to get a little confirmation that you can see the window that says Hadith, Sunnah and Madhab. So if you can, somebody just give me a quick chat. Yes, we can see it. Oh, brilliant. Alhamdulillah. Fantastic. Okay. So we've been on this journey now for many weeks, and it's been slow. We've savored the journey. I hope you've enjoyed it, and the videos are available also on YouTube, so you can look back and catch up if you want to. The notes will also be there as well. And the question we started with first of all was just what are the madhabs? We know about the four main madhabs of the Sunni group, and the imams of those madhabs. Who were they? What was their mission? We talked about the concept of tajdeed, that these people were kind of revivalists because they brought something new and special, and the whole idea of doing something fresh is to respond to the challenges of the time and to respond by trying to hold on to the authentic message of the Prophet ﷺ, the authentic teachings that have to remain relevant for all times. But as contexts change, then the teachings need to be looked at afresh. And that's what the Imams did. So they tried to capture what the Sunnah was, and quite often, like Imam Malik, we talked about first of all, wrote a book on the Sunnah, basically, and he encapsulated what he understood to be the Sunnah of the Prophet, so that people could then benefit from that book for all time. And he was constantly revising that book. We know about that. He started off with a huge book, which is like a good portion of his knowledge, you might say, and then he trimmed it because he probably started to realize that actually I want this to be for the benefit of most people, and they're not going to read that, right? They need something more like this. And it became more and more condensed essentially through his life, and some of the different versions are still available. Okay, and we talked about the meaning of Sunnah. We looked at how the Imams had their own unique understanding of what the Sunnah is as well, which of course is quite special too, and very very beneficial for us to actually get some awareness of. I will see why as well. Then we looked at reason, which Imams were more inclined towards applying reason and which ones were more cautious about it. And then we started the discussion of the interpretation of Hadith, and that's what we did last time, and we'll do more of that today. So as a quick recap, we know that in terms of the Sunnah, that it's the way, as I mentioned already, and it's obligatory. Following the Sunnah is obligatory, and that's why it's such an important issue. Okay, so in the Quran, Allah says that if you truly love Allah, then follow me, as in Muhammad, and Allah will love you, yuhibbukumullah, and He will forgive you your sins, and Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Wow, all you have to do is follow the Prophet, and that's the proof of your love of God. And O you who believe, obey Allah and obey His messenger, and turn not away from the messenger. Why is the Sunnah so important? Because the Prophet ﷺ exemplifies the Quran. The Quran is like, it's that direct communication with God. You read the Quran, it feels like Allah is talking to you. But then if you want the detail, you want to know how to exemplify that life and the nitty-gritty teachings, that's the Prophet. And as Aisha said, who knew him so well, that kana khuluquhul Quran, that his character was the Quran. He was the walking Quran. And we've seen that in the personality of the Prophet, that literally from the moment that his mission began to the moment that he breathed his last, his whole life was dedicated to saving people, to guiding people, to molding his community into people that were shaped by the Quran and by his mission, his message. by the new light that he had brought to everybody. And, this is exemplified in the suffering that he endured. And, it's his own personal suffering. I've got in front of you there is the kind of example of what happened when he went to Ta'if and the blood was running down his face and into his feet. His feet were sticking to his sandals. And even then he was saying, to Allah, that, "Oh Allah, forgive my people, for they know not what they do." Subhanallah. But also the loved ones, that how many loved ones did the Prophet ﷺ lose? How many of his near and dear for the sake of this mission, that they gave themselves for that mission. And we saw how the Prophet ﷺ exemplifies the noble teachings of the Quran. Now the Quran actually has commandment verses, and we talked about this last time, which encapsulate in a very short, concise way the kind of, a bit like the 10 commandments of Islam. And we looked at how, you could categorize them into 4 areas. One is believing in God, and then connecting with God, which is ibadah. And then the kind of virtues. How do you live a pious life? What is a good life? What is the good life, the pious life? What you call bir, okay? And then there's a whole lot of teachings. Here they are. Have a look. These are the commandments in the Quran, clearly laid out in these commandment verses. But have a look at last week's notes to learn more about that. And you can see that these are generic, as Sheikh Munir was saying already, that this is the goodness that's generic to people. It's not like somehow there's something very different about a good Muslim. A good Muslim is a good, fundamentally a good human being. And a good human being has got some of Islam in them, right? And that's the whole point of this understanding of bir. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ came to remind people, is get back to the kind of the beautiful purity of spirit that makes up the human being. Get back to that, and I'll show you how to live that, right? So there's a lot of stuff about the tongue there, a lot of stuff about charity, humility, freeing slaves, and then the actual rules, which are, like the actual commandments, you might say. And interesting amongst that is also the importance of justice as well, and being true to your word. And then we mentioned that very lovely quote of Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, who said that the foundation of the Sharia is wisdom and safeguarding of people's interests in this world and the next. And its entirety is justice, mercy, and wisdom. So that's what the Sharia is about. That's what the Quran is about. And of course, that's what the Sunna is about, because the Sharia is basically the Quran and the Sunna, right? And so sometimes people have interpreted things that kind of take you away from that essence and take you away from that purity of spirit that you would expect to find in Islam, right? And this is why he says that every rule which transcends justice to tyranny and mercy to its opposite, the good to evil, and wisdom to triviality, that doesn't belong in the Sharia. Something's gone wrong somewhere. That's not the Sharia. This is what Imam al-Qayyim says, which is, it's amazing. Now, the unique contributions of the Imams to understand the Sunnah. So this is what they did, is they encapsulated Sunnah, but they saw it in different ways. So Imam Malik, for instance, well, let's start with Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. So Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal had such, they're all extremely devout people, but Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal had such a dedication to the Sunnah. He was a collector of Hadith, and had this massive collection, the Sunan, the Musnad of Ahmad, in which he's collected 27,000 Hadith. So he wanted to be so sure that he's following the way of the Prophet, that if there was any Hadith which had a decent probability of being the Prophet's saying, he would follow that, rather than speculate about what the Prophet might have done in a new situation, you see? And that's what he collected in his Musnad. He didn't collect Hadith that were fabricated. He didn't collect Hadith that were like utterly weak and close to fabrication and utterly doubtful. But he collected Hadith that he felt had a fair chance of being the authentic word of the Prophet. Then you have Imam Shafi. Now, Imam Shafi, slightly different. He was one of the teachers of Imam Ahmad. Ahmad had lots of teachers, but one of them for a brief time was Imam Shafi. And Imam Shafi's approach was that he wanted to only follow authentic hadith. Okay, and he would rather go for authentic hadith, individual hadith, even if there's not many of them, just a single hadith. If it's authentic, he'll follow that rather than trying to draw sort of broader understandings of what Sunnah might be. Imam Malik, on the other hand, defined Sunnah as the practice of the people of Medina, because these were shaped by the Prophet, right? So he said that if a hadith is corroborated by the practice of Medina, then he'll follow it. And so, he had that approach, but he also was very strongly influenced by maslahah. So he was an imam of his people. He was the imam of the city. He came to, lots of people came to him with problems, and he would put everything through a filter of, okay, can this be practiced? If it can't be practiced, then drop it. Okay, and if something is beneficial to people, he will call that the Sharia and the Sunnah, essentially, even if it wasn't specifically there at the time of the Prophet. Imam Abu Hanifa had a similar approach. His idea, he was very analytical. His first premise was that if something's in the Quran and it's stated in a general way, that's a rule. So a hadith can't overturn that individual hadith, right? The Quran is on top. Okay, then you have Sunnah, which can add detail, okay, but it can't overrule the Quran. On top of that, the Imam Abu Hanifa had his students, and he worked with them to come to collective rulings, and they were talked about the idea that if you've got a hadith that is mutawatir, it's well known and through lots of separate chains, was kind of witnessed by lots of companions and passed through lots of chains, so it's incontrovertible, then that's going to be followed. Or if it's mashhur, so it's authentic and it's well known and widely circulated, then that would be a kind of sunnah that could be followed. Otherwise, they would take lots of hadith together, add to the opinions of companions as well, and together come to, well, what's our understanding of what the sunnah is meant to be. And sometimes they would go for an opinion of a companion, so a lesser evidence, you might say, over, say, an individual hadith, because that seemed to be more coherent and in line with the principles, which is called istihsan. Now, of course, Shafi didn't like that, because he wanted to strictly stick to hadith. And they also endorsed the practices of the people of the time as well, the Muslim communities of that time, as urf, it's called urf. So we have the example that we covered last time, where there's an ayah of the Quran. If we talk about, what kind of produce of the land, what kind of plants can be zakah? That was the question. So Imam Abu Hanifa has this approach that, well, there's an ayah of the Quran which actually states that look at all the wonderful things that grow, and of them give some in zakah, it says. So he says, well, that's a general rule, that everything is zakatable that grows. Everything that grows is zakatable. That was Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion. Now, there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that when he was sending people to Yemen, he said the specific things that they should tax, and that was wheat, barley, dates, and raisins. So Imam Abu Hanifa's students actually, because he had this very broad type of vision and was very good at arguing. So his students didn't really argue with that to begin with, but later they sort of said, well, it should be everything that grows, but as long as it can stay for a year, because the trend seems to be in what the Prophet is saying, that this is whatever can be dried, so it can be used as goods for sort of as a commodity, essentially. So, there's a difference of opinion, and other imams were much more strict about following literally what the Prophet ﷺ said. We've seen that. So you can see the example of the different approaches that the imams had. Then we looked at this question of reason. So do you follow literally what the Prophet said, or do you try to analyze and look at what the purpose behind what the Prophet said is? And, you know, there are benefits to each approach. If you stay very strict to what the Prophet said, you feel a bit more sure that, okay, I'm being sincere to the Prophet and safe. But of course, as time changes, the intent of what the Prophet wanted may have been something different. And what if you follow exactly what he said, might not be what the intention of the Sunnah is in that time. We'll see examples of that later. But actually, so which is right? And this question came up at the time of the Prophet, and we've seen from this hadith, the famous hadith of Banu Qurayza and the prayer of Asr, which you can look through in the notes. And the Prophet endorsed both. He didn't criticize any of the two approaches. One group of companions took his instruction literally. The other said, no, he meant something else, and they followed that. The Prophet allowed both, which is interesting, because that means that, look, we're not obliging you to follow any particular way. Nobody's obliged. There's the freedom to have different approaches, but don't let anyone say one is absolutely correct and that the people who follow the other way are condemned, right? The Prophet didn't condemn the different approaches, so who are we to condemn? Right. So now, okay, what about when it comes to individual hadith? Okay, so what we've done here is this whole question of, okay, how do you look at when there seems to be sometimes hadith which don't seem to correlate with what we would understand the Sunnah as being, right? We've talked about the nobility of the Sunnah, the beauty of the Sunnah, you know, the message of the Quran. And what if hadith don't seem to line up with that? What do you do in that situation? What have scholars done in the past? That's what we're looking at, because we want to try and maintain the dignity and, you know, the beauty of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And sometimes these things can create doubt. They can create a sense of confusion as well. And that's what we're trying to address here. So we've looked at how the Imams looked at conflicting hadith. Right, we've already started looking at that just now, but also sometimes hadith seem to go against the Quran, and what do you do then? And other times they go against the Sunnah. So the Sunnah, as in what's been broadly understood as the Sunnah, not just, you know, hadith, but the wider idea of what the Sunnah is. Right. Sometimes there's the need to look at context, and then there's also so sometimes an ambiguity that when the Prophet ﷺ is saying something, does he mean it as a you have to do this, or is he recommending it but not obliging you to? And that might not be clear in hadith. And very often the context isn't there in one hadith. It doesn't state it. And then you have to look at other hadith to get it, right? And then there's the literal and metaphorical. Some hadith can't be understood literally. They have to be understood metaphorically. And we'll look at abrogation and the capacities of the Prophet, which is really important. Okay, so we've looked at how the madhabs dealt with conflicting hadith. And there's a very interesting quote of a student of Imam Malik. That he says that, you know, were it not for Malik bin Anas and Layth bin Sa'ad, I'd have perished. Because I used to think that everything that's authentically related from the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, must be put into practice. And he says that, you know, when he met Layth and Malik, they would say to him, take this and leave that. And the Prophet and the approach of Imam Malik was that if the hadith didn't correlate with the practice of Medina, he parked it, right? So the practice had to endorse the hadith. That was his approach. And we've seen how the different Imams have different approaches to this. But so much so that in the Muwatta, Imam Malik's book, he would actually mention hadith that he doesn't practice. So he'd mention the hadith to make it clear to everyone that, look, I'm fully aware of this hadith, but for this reason, in Medina, we don't practice it. You see? Okay. Now, hadith that appear to contradict the Quran. We've looked at this hadith where a person came to the Prophet said, and his father had passed away, and said, where's my father now? And the Prophet said that your father and my father are in the fire. And it seems contradictory, and it seems like, well, does that mean that all people before Islam are automatically in the fire? And Sheikh Munir already mentioned this about the ayah of the Quran which clearly says that we don't punish until we send a messenger. So unless people have had the opportunity objectively to see the guidance, it's not fair that they should be punished, right? So we've actually looked at this and we analyzed that hadith. Okay. Then we had to look at a hadith which contradicts or appears to contradict the Sunnah. So we looked at this hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ seemed to say that when you see Jews and Christians, you don't greet them, and that when you're passing by them, try and squeeze them into the narrowest part of the path, like kind of bully and intimidate them. And we've seen how this, is certainly not the general Sunnah of the Prophet by any means. And we looked at the context of that as well. And that's all in the attendant notes, and we looked at that last week. Okay. Then we had to look at the importance of analyzing context. So we looked at, for instance, the trailing sarongs. Sometimes people lift their trousers, but the Sunnah is actually of sarongs, robes that Prophet sometimes wore, that they would sometimes trail, and it's that which he said, don't let it trail. Okay. And we looked at, well, what if it happens out of humility and that was excused? We looked at the thing about traveling, that women were barred from traveling without a mahram, and that today people are still following that, and it seems to cause undue hardship, but that wasn't what the Prophet intended. He intended for a society one day where there would be so much safety that women could travel alone, and he mentions that in an authentic hadith as well, right? So that's how far we've got. And then we also had to look at obligations and preferences, that sometimes the Prophet said something, but it maybe as a preference. Like there's a very strong hadith which talks about not drinking while standing. You may have come across that. But at other times, there's another authentic hadith also in Muslim, and the other one was in Sahih Muslim, which says that we used to eat and drink while standing when we were with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we looked at how actually, well, then it's a recommendation is what the Prophet is meaning there, right? Now, what about where the literal cannot be accepted? So let's have a look at this hadith, and I want you to have a little think about this. And it's a beautiful hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says that in the last third of the night, you've heard it, right? Where the last third of the night, Allah descends to the lowest heaven. And the lowest heaven, there's a confusion sometimes. In English, heaven can mean Jannah, right? The paradise, and it can also mean sky. But that in Arabic is sama. So here we're talking about the lowest sky, which, you could interpret as like our sky here or something, the atmosphere, or the canopy around the earth, you might say. Okay. So Allah descends to the lowest sky, and then he says, who is calling that I may answer him? Who is asking forgiveness that I may forgive him? Or who's asking of me that I may give him? And it's a lovely hadith because it makes you feel something, don't you think? Can you take that literally? What's the problem with taking it literally? Can someone pipe up with an answer to that question? Why can't you take that literally? So think about, you could start with the assumption that this is the canopy around the earth, or it could be a different heaven. If we say there are 7 heavens, there's 7 layers, sab'a samawatin, as it mentions in the Quran, right? Tabaqatin, tibaqa, one upon another. But the lowest one, he descends to the lowest one, right? But, you could say, well, the lowest possible one is the sky just above us, surely, right? Yeah, so absolutely. So this is, I'm liking the responses. There's some very good responses here. So people have said, well, Allah moving, descending, not knowing who's calling him. Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. And that, it's always night somewhere. Somewhere it's always, we know now that the earth is round. So at all times, there's a lowest third of the night. Does that mean that actually at all times, Allah is kind of like stuck in the lowest third of the heaven? Now the lowest heaven? Do you see how you cannot take this literally? There's some philosophical elements to this as well, is that part of our creed is understanding that Allah is beyond space and time. So if you literally understand him as descending, you have to then understand that there's then something above him. Do you really believe there's something above Allah? We can't believe that, right? So he's outside space and time. And also moving, that we don't believe that he moves in the way that a human moves, you know, up and down and left and right. That's a kind of biblical interpretation. Or maybe even in the Bible, it's meant metaphorically. Allah, I'm not going to, you know, comment on the Bible as such, right? So fundamentally, you can't take this literally. And also the thing that, who is asking me that I may give him? What? Do you mean like Allah doesn't even know who's asking? He knows anyway. Why does he need to ask that question? You see the point? That's not the purpose of this hadith. You cannot take it literally, but when you take it metaphorically, it does something to your heart, doesn't it? I feel so inspired because the feeling is there. And that's what the Prophet was trying to say. He's meaning it metaphorically, that, you know, he's especially responsive to you in that special time of the night, and that you ask and Allah will give it. So it's being embellished into a type of story to make it more sort of, you know, relatable, you might say, right? Okay, let's move on. Now, this is an interesting one. The Prophet ﷺ says that, and you know, we've, and this is authentic as well. It's been authenticated by Sheikh Al-Albani, and you've seen this quoted at times, right? And you may have seen it quoted in the context of dress. So the Prophet ﷺ said that whoever imitates a people is one of them. Now, can you tell me, let's have some more of these amazing comments now, that what's the problem with taking that literally? Tell me that. Okay. Whoever imitates a people is one of them. And the implication is that obviously if you're imitating non-Muslims, then you're one of them, meaning that it's a bad thing, right? Fundamentally, it's a bad thing that, you know, if they're headed for the fire, you're headed for the fire too. Don't do it. Do you get the point? Yeah. So I want to hear some ideas on where, you know, where there could be issues with the interpretation of this hadith, and that, you know, where it's just difficult to take it literally, because there's an important message there, and in some ways by taking it literally you miss the message, right? So, you know, like when Allah ascends and descends, you know, if you start thinking about the mechanics of it, the philosophy of it, you are totally missing the point. And that hadith hasn't touched your heart. All it's done is create a tangle in your head. Do you see? So what's the problem with saying, you know, with understanding literally that whoever imitates a person is one of them? Okay, the chat group is a bit quiet. Right, so someone has said food, dress, language. Well, yes. What about language? So you start speaking the language, you start taking on the idioms of a people, and maybe most of them don't even accept or believe in God. That makes you one of them. You can't use their language. Now, funnily enough, for some reason, people get really hung up on just dress, right? But if you're going to take that hadith, take it completely. Brilliant point, Alex. Why don't you take it completely? Say, well, the language as well, of course, right? Yes, so the other problem, Rashid mentioning, that there are good and bad aspects of all peoples. You know, if you are going to go as far as generalizing about people, then there are good aspects as well. Are you not supposed to follow those either? Right? We don't wait in queue. We don't turn up on time. We don't have a sense of fair play. Is that because that's there? You know, right now we're seeing a tremendous national spirit. If everyone came out on the streets and clapped and cheered at 8 o'clock last Friday, is that something we don't do because we don't want to imitate the people? Do you see the point? Yeah, and there are also examples of, so someone mentions that there are examples, Brother Shakil, of the Prophet doing things that other people did, right? So like digging the trench around Medina to defend against the attackers. So Was that imitating what the Persians do? Do you see the point? It's not about that. It's about whoever imitates the bad practices, maybe the religious observances of another community, right? That's what it's about. And what about, like, you know, someone who in heart and in practice is already a Muslim, but they haven't become a Muslim yet? Do you say, well, no, I can't be like that person? It's just, you know, do you see what I mean? You're missing the point and you're losing out on the beauty of a message there, right? Very good. Okay. Let's move on. Abrogation in conflicting hadith. So sometimes, you know, something is said, and actually the Prophet seems to say exactly the opposite. And how can that make sense? So, for instance, you know, there's a hadith in which the Prophet condemned women visiting graves. Okay, and actually he condemned everyone visiting graves. So there's a hadith in which he says that, you know, I had forbidden you to visit graves, but now I say visit them. You know how even now women aren't allowed in Jannatul Baqi because of that hadith. Okay. But then how is it that when Aisha asked the Prophet ﷺ, when she's going to the graveyard, how shall I address the people of the grave? She asked the Prophet, how shall I address them? How could she have been allowed there? Is it a special privilege for the wife of the Prophet? No, right? There's another hadith in which a woman was weeping by the graveside and getting really emotional, and the Prophet ﷺ said that you know, fear God and be patient, and she said, go away, you know, you haven't suffered the way I've suffered. She didn't know it was the Prophet ﷺ. But what was she doing there? Why didn't the Prophet say, leave, what are you doing? You know, you're not allowed here, right? He just asked her to be patient. Do you see? So the evidences are there. The evidences are there. It just shows how, you know, actually the rule changed. That's what it was. Right. Now we're moving on to the capacities of the Prophet. SubhanAllah, a very important topic, which I will try to scoot through. So this is a really, really important area of understanding the Sunnah. And in many ways, this clears up a lot of confusion that people have about who the Prophet ﷺ was, right? Because the Prophet fundamentally was a messenger. He was sent by God to bring light to people's lives, to save them from the darkness of not knowing God, from the darkness of oppression, oppressing themselves and oppressing other people, right? From behavior that's just not going to help them, and from leading them towards a life of love, a life of mercy and compassion. This is fundamentally what his job was, right? And you've misunderstood the Prophet if you've seen him as anything other than what he is meant to be. That's the idea. So there's an amazing book. Do read if you can. If you've got time. You've got time, guys. This is the book. Okay, take a look at it. Oh, it's in reverse. Sorry. Okay, so Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence. It's big, but it's a riveting read by Professor Muhammad Hashim Kamali, who's a professor at the Malaysian Islamic University, and has written basically the most comprehensive book of Usul al-Fiqh in the English language. Brilliant, brilliant. And it, you know, when I read it, it was just an amazing eye-opener, and it made you really understand who the Prophet is, right? So he says, now listen to this, he says that whatever the Prophet has authorized pertaining to the principles of religion, especially in the areas of devotional matters, ibadat, and rules expounding the lawful and unlawful, halal and haram, these constitute general legislation whose validity is not restricted to time and circumstance. That's what the Prophet was here for, ibadat, and making clear what is lawful and prohibited for people generally. Okay? So, these are the kind of teachings that you say, right, this is a prophet, a messenger of God speaking, where the Prophet ﷺ says that, you know, my comparison, my parable is like a person who lights a fire. The comparison of me and the people is like a person who lights a fire. And then, you know, insects and moths come from all around towards the fire. And I'm stood there in front of the fire trying to save them, right? And they're trying to rush into the fire. This is what the Prophet is about, is that he's trying to save people from the fire. And he's here to teach the people what it is specifically that's going to save them, right? And there are other hadith which is just so beautiful, and you know, you just see, right, this is the guidance. So, for instance, in the Hadith Qudsi, the Prophet said, a man came, a man from those people who came before you, and was called to account, as in on the Day of Judgment, and nothing in terms of goodness was found in him, except that he used to have dealings with people, and being well-to-do, that he would just order his servants to let off the person that was in straitened circumstances. Somebody had borrowed some money from him, he's in a tight, and he's just like, oh, just go, it's okay, no problems. Yeah, subhanAllah. And the Prophet, and then Allah says that we are worthier than you of that. Let him off. Allah is Al-Kareem, the most generous and the most noble, who doesn't like to be trumped in nobility and generosity, right? And he can't be. So he's like, you're noble and generous, I'll show you generosity, off you go. That's the, you know, wow, you know, that. So anyway, you see them and they're so inspiring. So this is fundamentally what the Prophet was about. Now let's have a look at his capacity as a human being. All right, so for instance, here's a story in which companions came to the Prophet ﷺ, and meat was brought before the Prophet, and the companions were with him. All right, so the meat's there, and his wife says, Maymuna says, oh, this is lizard meat. And the Prophet ﷺ said to the companions, eat, for it is lawful, but it's not part of my diet. So what do the companions do now? Do they listen to the Prophet, or do they follow his sunnah? If the sunnah of the Prophet is not to eat lizard meat, but his instruction is the opposite, he's saying eat it. Do you see that this is actually just his personal preference as a human being? He don't dig on lizard meat, right? And that's probably, I probably feel the same, maybe, you know. So they could say out of love of the Prophet, they'd say, no, Ya Rasulullah, we don't want to eat it either because we love you. But, you know, they ate, right? Because they understood that's not really the issue. And then we see that, you know, at times people would come to the Prophet ﷺ and say, Ya Rasulullah, is this what you're saying part of wahi, part of revelation? Or is this your own personal preference? And then they would do the opposite. You see that, right? And so Hisham Kamali, again, he says that non-legal sunnah, this is like sunnah, like the way of the Prophet, you might say hadith about the Prophet, that aren't part of the sunnah that's to be followed, the sunnah tashri'ah. So this kind of sunnah mainly consists of natural activities of the Prophet, such as the manner in which he ate, slept, dressed, other activities that don't seek to constitute part of the Sharia. Right? Activities of this nature are not of primary importance to the prophetic mission, and therefore do not constitute legal norms. Right? And that's the opinion of the majority of the ulama. So, like the Prophet having favorite colors, the way he slept, that he slept on his right hand side, right? And that's just permissibility, but it's not obligation. So, for instance, you know, the Prophet rode camels. Do we have to ride camels? Should we ride? If we love the Prophet, do we follow his sunnah? Do we ride camels the way he did? He spoke Arabic. Do we have to speak to each other in Arabic? You know, some people do Jummah khutbah specifically in Arabic because the Prophet did. Do we have to do that? Again, it's about, you've missed the purpose of the khutbah. It's a sermon to guide people. You're guiding people by speaking a language they don't understand. Do you see the point? Okay. And now let's have a look at the Sunnah dress code. Okay. Now this is very interesting because the Prophet ﷺ, actually, when you look at his Sunnah, he wore different things. There isn't like, oh, he has to wear a white thobe. right, with some kind of special headdress. He wore different things at different times. Particularly, he wore trousers sometimes. Sometimes he wore a sarong, right, a lungi, as we say in the kind of in Urdu, as well. And then he'd wear overgarments, and the overgarments could come from anywhere. It's not, he wasn't particularly fussy. He liked nice overgarments and they came from different places and different people, right? So there's a hadith that Anas bin Malik, who knew the Prophet very well, he was his attendant, and he says that when people asked him, what did you really like to wear? He says he wore a mantle from Yemen. And then there are other times when, for instance, a story that the Prophet was gifted a coat, a fur coat with fine silk around the edges, and the Prophet wore it. Another time that Asma bint Abi Bakr, the daughter of Abu Bakr, who's sister of Aisha, was brought out this Persian overgarment, and its pockets were lined with silk brocade, so it was very smart, so nice. And he says that she said the Prophet really liked this, and that after that people used to use it tabarrukan, as kind of like, you know, as a blessing for healing. So Omar Farooq Abdullah, who's a scholar that you really want to read about, has done some amazing articles, American scholar, and he writes that much of what became the Prophet's Sunnah was made up of acceptable pre-Islamic Arab cultural norms, and the principle of tolerating and accommodating such practices among the Arabs and non-Arabs alike in all their diversity may be termed a supreme overriding prophetic Sunnah. So the Sunnah is not which clothes he wore, but the fact that he wore the clothes that his people wore, right? And amongst trading Arabs, it was quite customary for them to wear nice clothes that come from different parts of the world. So it's not, you don't have to now find a Persian, robe and wear that, feeling that that's part of the Sunnah, right? Or the headdress the Prophet wore because that's part of the Sunnah. Do you get it? So what he's saying is the supreme Sunnah is you wear what the people were wearing, your people were wearing. That's the overriding Sunnah. Quickly, medicine. So the science and medicine is a really important thing to understand as well. The Prophet ﷺ was not a scientist, and he wasn't a doctor. That was not what he was sent to mankind to offer them. And if that's not understood, let me show you two hadith. So there is a hadith in which the Prophet came to Medina, and the people of Medina used to graft their date palms. And he said, it's a bit weird. I think it's better essentially that you don't do this. And the next year, people came back and said, Ya Rasulullah, our plants haven't grown. And he said, you have better knowledge of the affairs of your world. They were following the Prophet, and the Prophet said, nah, you have better knowledge of the affairs of your world. And there's another narration, this is all in Sahih Muslim, that the Prophet said, if doing so would benefit them, then do so. Verily, I had an opinion, so don't blame me for my opinion. If I tell you something about Allah, adhere to it. I never lie about Allah Almighty. You see, if the point wasn't quite clear, he's made it crystal clear here. His purpose is to teach people about what God loves. That's his point. That's his mission in life, right? So, there's another one. Okay, let's have a look at another science one. So, for instance, people came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, how do children resemble one parent or the other? And the Prophet ﷺ said that basically, essentially, that when having intercourse, the person who, whether the parent who climaxes first is the one that the child resembles. Now, we know that's not scientifically correct, okay? But that's obviously a speculation of what he understood, and it might have been what people understood at the time. That's all it is. What about healing? Is the Quran healing? So we have a verse in the Quran which says that, and we sent down the Quran, that which is of the Quran, that which is a healing and mercy to the believers, but it does not increase the wrongdoers except in loss. But then there's another part of the Quran which clarifies what that means, right? So people kind of feel that, oh, you know, certain verses will cure this and cure that, but actually the Quran makes it clear that, oh mankind, there has come to you instruction from your Lord, a cure for whatever disease is in your hearts. That's the kind of cure we're talking about. It's a cure for the diseases of the heart, right? I don't mean, you know, heart failure as in ventricular systolic dysfunction, or, you know, coronary artery disease, that kind of heart. I mean, the heart is in the spiritual heart, right? Let's have a look at this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Utilize the black seed, for without a doubt it is a cure for all sickness aside from death. And that's in Sahih Bukhari. So what do you think of that? What's your opinion on that hadith? Do you think that you could utilize that? Can we use that with coronavirus? Do you think that we could sort of infuse essence of black seed and it will cure COVID-19 when people are in ITU? Or if people have got disseminated cancer and they're just in their last legs, that all they needed was black seed, will it unclog coronary arteries? Do you see what I mean? That's something that maybe was a treatment for some, not absolutely every kind of disease. Do you understand? It may have helped with some illnesses. It's just like in the Quran, it talks about honey being a healing, right? So we know that it has medicinal properties. It's used to dress wounds now, right? But it doesn't mean that it cures everything, really. Do you know what I mean? Okay, and actually when you see other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it's quite clear that what he's instructing people to do is go out and find a cure, that there is a cure for every disease, go and find it. And that there are a number of hadith in that respect, which are authentic as well, okay? Meaning that, you know, if the cure was black seed for everything, why would he say go and find the cure? He would say just use black seed every time, right? But he's saying there is a cure for things, go and find them. So let's just look at the next capacity briefly, which is as a ruler. Now this is interesting to note that the Prophet ﷺ sometimes made instructions as a ruler, and the details of this will be in the notes, but just as a summary, there's a hadith, for instance, that where he says that whoever kills a warrior in a battle may take his belongings. Now, does that mean you can loot, essentially? And does that mean that you can kind of like, you know, just literally scavenge what? But that was customary at the time, and it's what the Prophet ﷺ allowed his followers to do. But people have done it for centuries, of course, quite normal. But it's not what we expect to do now. And actually, many of the imams said that this is contextual as a ruler. He meant it in the capacity of ruler. So let's take another brilliant example of this, that he said that whoever reclaims barren land becomes its owner. So does that mean that you can go to a national trust property or national park, go climb up, you know, some of the sort of windswept areas of Snowdonia or something, and just start tilling the land, put your little house there and everything, take it over? No, right? So this again was that originally it was Imam Abu Hanifa who said, no, this is in the context only as a ruler, and it's the ruler that makes those sorts of rights, and he was a ruler, so he had the right to make those sort of pronouncements. And later other imams joined him, or other scholars, and that's, you know, as the context changed and more land became cultivated, you couldn't have people randomly taking land, okay? So that's the clarification of those two hadith. And now you could say that in actual fact, some of the punishments of the Prophet, if they weren't in the Quran, then he actually instituted them as a ruler. I mean, they didn't have a prison service, right? So this was the corporal punishments at the time were a conventional way of punishing people, and that's what the Prophet ﷺ did, right? Slavery also, you could say, well, some tribes he enslaved and some he didn't. In the conquest of Mecca, he didn't enslave the Quraysh, right? So why was it, partial? Because that's his prerogative as a ruler, right? So there's no obligation. The Prophet enslaved, conquered people, therefore we should do that. No, he was a ruler at the time where it was conventional to do that if the ruler found that that was going to be the best way to control his tribe, and then he did it. Do you see? But now we have the Geneva Convention on Human Rights, etc. The world has changed, and the rulers have to comply with the rules that they've signed up to. As a mufti, now this is an interesting instance. The Prophet ﷺ was also a mufti. People came to him with questions about faith, and he gave them answers of halal, haram for them, but specifically for individuals sometimes. And that's also important to understand. So remember, for instance, when there was a need to fight jihad, people were attacking Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ exempted one young man because he was caring for an elderly mother and there was nobody else that could care for them. So it's not like all young men are exempt, right? So this is him as a mufti giving a fatwa, a ruling for a particular person in a particular circumstance. So an old man came to the Prophet, and the companions were sat with him, and he said, they were fasting. And he said, can I kiss my wife? And the Prophet said, yes. And then someone else came, a younger man, can I kiss my wife? And said, no. And the Prophet saw the companions are looking at each other going, what? And he explained that he can control himself. The old man can control himself. Yeah. And the other interesting final one we're going to touch on is as a judge, and then we're done. So the Prophet sometimes made rulings as a judge. So if we take a look at, for instance, let's look at this, this instance. So Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, and we know before, she became Muslim. So before she became Muslim, she obviously did something that was quite despicable. But then she became Muslim, and she came to the Prophet ﷺ talking about how stingy her husband was, Abu Sufyan, the great chief of Mecca. And she said, he doesn't offer me enough support for me and my child. What can I do? And the Prophet ﷺ said, take what is sufficient for yourself and your child according to custom. Yeah, so in other words, whatever's conventionally normal for you to take. Should that, now give me a thought on this. Should that be the Prophet pronouncing a rule for all women at all times? Or is it that he made that pronouncement as a judge? So she was coming to him as the judge of Medina, and he's making a judgment that Abu Sufyan must tolerate that you take whatever you want to take from that, whatever you need to take from his wealth. What do you think? What's better? Would it be better for that to be a ruling for all time for women, or would it be better as to see that as his ruling as in the capacity of a judge? Let's see some responses to that. Okay, so somebody has mentioned that black seed will cure coronavirus. Okay. So what's the opinion on? So I mean, the point is that realistically, black seed isn't going to cure everything, and we have to understand that there are capacities of the Prophet. Just like when he said, "Don't graft trees," that he meant that just as that's his opinion. It doesn't mean that grafting is haram, and he made that very clear that on your worldly affairs you have more knowledge. There's a phenomenal amount of knowledge and expertise that is going into saving lives, and we can't assume that black seed will literally cure everything. Why are we taking that hadith literally when everything else has to be looked at in its context? There are hadith we know that you just cannot take literally. That's my point, really. Right. So, but anyway, yeah. So someone's saying that he knew the situation of Abu Sufyan and that he had surplus. Okay, and the last ruling as a judge may be used as a general principle to safeguard the rights of wives. Maybe meant that the husband should provide for the wife. Yeah. So look, no doubt the husband should provide for the wife. And the whole problem here is that she's coming to him complaining that he's not providing, he's not doing his duty, right? So he's going off trading, he's phenomenally wealthy, and he's not, and he's being tight. What's wrong with this guy? That's what she's saying, essentially, right? Now, the interesting point here is that the majority of scholars, in fact, more or less unanimously, have said that this was mentioned in the capacity of him as a judge. She came to him as a judge, he made a judgment. Now, the reason that that's actually quite beneficial to understand is that actually it protects women more. That actually if they go to an Islamic authority, then it's incumbent on the Islamic authority to use that hadith as a precedent. Right? But of course, when the judge makes the judgment, the husband has got to comply. The problem with seeing this as just something that wives can do, which, in most normal relationships they can. Of course, that's normal, isn't it? A lot of people have joint bank accounts, we do, and I'm sure lots of people do. So that's normal, right? But it's for the weird situation where a person's being controlling, which actually in this country now is illegal. It's a type of domestic abuse. Right, and quite rightly so. But someone who's being very controlling of, well, it's financial abuse, being very controlling of a person's finances to the point where that it's making their life it's like they're imprisoned. It's a real injustice. So in that situation with that kind of person, if they just go helping themselves, what's going to happen? Chances are this is the sort of oppressive, abusive, aggressive type of person, and they may lash out physically. So it's actually better that this becomes a precedent for judges, that they go to the authorities, and every Islamic scholar that they go to will say, bring your husband here, I'll have a word with him. And explain that, look, no, the Sunnah of the Prophet is she's allowed her rights. And do you see, so this is, again, it's a beauty of understanding the capacities of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so this is it. So we've come to the end of the presentation. I apologize, it's taken a long time, and this actually wraps up the whole section on understanding hadith. And you can see how, there are hadith which you look at, and it depends what kind of person you are. And this is the whole point, that for some people, they will take the hadith literally, and they're happy with that. And I'm not criticizing that, but I'm saying that there are times when you have to be a little bit more analytical, that the analytical approach also helps to sometimes tidy up the apparent conflicts, and that sometimes actually, you do an injustice, like for instance, prohibiting women from going to the graveside is not something the Prophet did. He did it initially, but he didn't do it later. So it's an injustice. Constraining women, saying they can't travel alone, when actually the intention of the Prophet was to create societies that would be safe enough for women to travel in, and that was explained last week. This is the whole idea that, when we understand that the Prophet was a messenger, but he was human, and he had his likes, he had his dislikes, and hey, that's cool. He was an Arab, and that's fine. So many of the things were just cultural, and they're normal for him to have done in his context. So we shouldn't find them unusual. For instance, we know that the Prophet instructed his companions when they go to the toilet to use 3 stones. But don't feel weird about that. It's just what they did there, because that was normal, right? It was helpful, it's conventional. We've got alternatives now, and that's fine. Yeah, so it helps to really kind of like to sift out the messenger, this man who is like light in its figurative sense. Yeah, who's inspired and transformed a society. And this is what we want to follow. This is the light that we want to absorb. And this is the inspiration we want to follow from the human aspect. And he's a human being, and that's wonderful, right? But it also helps us then to sort of say, well, the human elements were for that context and that time. And scholars, as we'll see, as you'll see if you read through the notes, scholars have helped to clarify that in so many ways. So we don't need to get confused about these points. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up now, inshallah. Next time, we're going to be talking about choosing a madhab. Which madhab am I going to recommend to you? And actually a scholar, you might say, okay, right. And it's not going to be a simple one-word answer, so don't worry. It will be an entire presentation. I'm just checking to see if there's any final questions. There was a question about silk, and isn't that interesting that, you know, are we allowed to then wear silk? You know, I'm not mufti, so I'm not going to say, but if you have a look, there are even things like, you know, can you wear a gold ring? Well, if it's gold plated, some scholars say it's okay. It's about solid, so like a full silk shirt. But if it's got little bits of silk here and there, is it allowed? Well, the Prophet wore things with like little bits of silk, as we can see. So Allahu Alam, you know, consult the muftis on that. That's not my job. Okay. Khair, we're going to end now, inshallah. Thank you for being on the journey with me. And as I said, the notes will be available. Please do read them, imbibe them, and share them. I think it's so important for our community to really understand this. It will help them to love the Prophet more, because then they won't be confused when they see some of these hadith that actually show him as human, that we know were contextual, and we know that if you delve deep and ask the scholars, you'll find the context for. So we don't need to worry, right? The problem is that there are haters out there who want to show you these hadith and challenge your faith, or want to tell everybody else how horrible Islam is, right? So we have to be one step ahead in knowing that these hadith exist and that there are ways of understanding these properly. Okay, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ya Rab, give us a love for our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Give us a desire and the tawfiq to live by his light, Ya Allah. Give us the desire to learn about him, to know his every detail, and to follow him in all the good that he brought to us. Make us people of light, people that share that prophetic light that he gave, that he brought to us, so that we can be beacons of that same message to everybody else around us. Ameen. And Ya Allah, keep us safe in these times, keep us optimistic, give us opportunities to turn to in these times, give us opportunities to connect with one another, even though we can't physically connect with one another, Ya Allah. And Ya Allah, give us the desire, the burning to get closer to you now that we have more time to do this, and to connect to the Quran and to the teachings and the beauty of your religion. وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.